The Messerschmitt Bf 109 killed more of its own pilots than most people realize. And we're not talking about combat losses. Brand new pilots were dying during their first flights. Experienced aces were getting trapped in cockpits they couldn't escape from, and others were being cooked alive by engine fires they had no way to put out. Newly discovered footage reveals just how brutal it actually was to fly Germany's most famous fighter, and the numbers are absolutely staggering. Before we get into what made this aircraft so deadly to its own pilots, you need to understand something crucial. The Bf 109 wasn't designed with pilot safety in mind, at all. When Willy Messerschmitt's team began work on this fighter in 1934, they had one obsession: speed and performance above everything else. The result was an aircraft that could outfly almost anything in the sky, but it came with compromises that would kill thousands of German pilots before the war even ended. The narrow landing gear is where most of the carnage happened. Unlike other fighters of the era, the Bf 109's main wheels were mounted close together on the fuselage rather than out on the wings. This gave the aircraft better aerodynamics and made the wings lighter, which improved performance. But it also made the plane horrifically unstable on the ground. During takeoff and landing, the slightest crosswind or uneven surface could flip the aircraft onto its nose or send it careening sideways into a ground loop. Pilots called it the Widowmaker, and for good reason. Training accidents were an absolute bloodbath. In 1937, before the war even started, the Luftwaffe lost more Bf 109 seconds to landing accidents than they did to all other causes combined. New pilots with only a few hours in the cockpit were expected to master an aircraft that even veterans struggled to land safely. There was no two-seat trainer version early in the war, so your first flight in a Bf 109 was solo. You either figured it out or you died trying. Here's what that actually looked like. You're a young pilot, maybe 19 years old, and you've just climbed into the cockpit of one of the most advanced fighters in the world. The instructor gives you a quick briefing on the ground, tells you to watch your speed and keep the wings level, then sends you off. The moment you apply throttle for takeoff, the aircraft wants to veer left because of engine torque. You overcorrect right, the narrow gear can't handle the side load, and suddenly, you're cartwheeling across the airfield in a shower of torn metal and burning fuel. This happened constantly, but let's say you survive the takeoff. You're now dealing with a cockpit that's trying to kill you in different ways. The canopy design was a nightmare. Early models used a side-opening canopy that had to be manually unlatched and pushed open. Sounds simple enough until you're inverted in a crashed aircraft or sinking into the English Channel, and you physically cannot get the canopy open because the frame has bent or the latch is jammed. Pilots drowned in their cockpits. They burned to death while trapped just inches from freedom. Visibility was another massive problem that doesn't get talked about enough. The heavy framing around the canopy created huge blind spots, especially to the rear and below. In combat, this meant you couldn't see enemy fighters approaching from your 6 o'clock until they were already firing. But even during routine flights, it made formation flying and landing significantly more dangerous because you simply couldn't see what was around you. The engine placement created its own set of horrors. The Daimler-Benz engine sat directly in front of the cockpit, with only a thin firewall separating the pilot from over 1,000 horsepower of mechanical violence. When that engine caught fire, and it did with alarming frequency, flames would pour back into the cockpit within seconds. The fuel tank was located directly behind the pilot's seat in many variants. If an enemy round punctured that tank, burning fuel would flood the cockpit from behind, while engine fire came from the front. Footage from training bases shows just how common these accidents were. In one clip, from 1940, you can see 3 separate Bf 109 seconds nose over during landing attempts in a single day at the same airfield. Another shows a pilot trying to bail out of a burning aircraft, but he's too low and hits the ground before his parachute opens. These weren't rare incidents captured on camera. This was Tuesday. The Luftwaffe knew they had a problem. Internal documents from 1939 show that senior officers were genuinely concerned about the accident rate, but they were trapped. The Bf 109 was the best fighter they had, and there was no alternative that could match its performance. So pilots kept dying in training, kept getting trapped in cockpits, kept slamming into the ground during routine landings. What made this even worse was how the aircraft's deadliest characteristics evolved as the war progressed and new variants appeared. The Bf 109E, which dominated the Battle of Britain, had manageable handling quirks if you knew what you were doing. But then came the F model with a more powerful engine, and suddenly everything got worse. That extra power made the torque effect even more violent during takeoff. Pilots who had hundreds of hours in the E model found themselves fighting the F model just to keep it pointed down the runway. Then the G model appeared, and this is where things went completely off the rails. The G was supposed to be the ultimate evolution of the design, but instead it became a death trap that killed experienced pilots at an alarming rate. Engineers kept bolting on heavier weapons, more armor, larger fuel tanks, all while using the same basic airframe. The result was an aircraft that was nose-heavy, tail-heavy, and barely controllable depending on fuel load and ammunition state. The center of gravity shifted dramatically as fuel burned off and ammo was expended, meaning the aircraft handled completely differently at the end of a mission compared to the beginning. You couldn't develop muscle memory because the aircraft's behavior changed constantly. Stall characteristics became downright murderous in the G model. Where earlier versions gave you some warning before a stall, the G would snap without notice. One moment you're in controlled flight, the next you're spinning toward the ground with maybe 2,000 feet to recover. Many pilots didn't have that altitude to spare. The increased weight also meant landing speeds went up significantly. You were now touching down at speeds that gave you almost no margin for error. Miss your approach by even a small amount and you'd either stall and drop hard onto the runway or come in too fast and run out of space before you could stop. Ground loops became even more common because the faster landing speed meant more energy that the narrow landing gear couldn't handle. But here's something that really shows how deadly the design had become. Soviet pilots who tested captured Bf-109Gs wrote detailed reports about the aircraft. These were experienced combat pilots who had flown dozens of different aircraft types. Their assessment was brutal. They noted the aircraft was difficult to control on the ground, prone to flipping over, and had handling characteristics that would get inexperienced pilots killed. This wasn't propaganda. These were internal Soviet documents never meant for public consumption. German training units were hemorrhaging pilots and aircraft. By 1943, some training groups were losing more pilots to accidents than to combat. Think about that for a second. You were statistically more likely to die learning to fly the aircraft than you were to die fighting the enemy in it. The Luftwaffe tried to address this by extending training programs and being more selective about who got to fly fighters. But Germany was running out of time and running out of pilots. They needed bodies in cockpits immediately, which meant rushing people through training before they were truly ready. This created a vicious cycle where inadequately trained pilots crashed more frequently, which meant even fewer pilots available, which meant training had to be rushed even more. Meanwhile, the aircraft itself kept getting heavier and more complicated with each new variant. The K model that appeared near the end of the war was even worse than the G in terms of handling. It had slightly better performance at altitude, but the trade-off was an aircraft that was even more unforgiving. Pilots who survived the war later admitted they were terrified of the Bf-109, not because of what the enemy might do, but because of what the aircraft itself might do. One Luftwaffe ace described it as flying an aircraft that was constantly trying to kill you. You had to fight it every single second you were in the air. There was no relaxing, no letting your guard down. The moment you stopped actively controlling it, something would go wrong. This wasn't just a problem for novice pilots either. Even experienced aces occasionally made mistakes, and the Bf-109 punished mistakes instantly and severely. There are documented cases of pilots with dozens of kills who died in simple training accidents because they misjudged a landing or lost focus for just a moment during takeoff. The narrow landing gear that we keep coming back to was ultimately the design's original sin. Everything else stemmed from that one decision made back in the mid-30s. But by the time anyone realized how serious the problem was, millions of man-hours and enormous resources had been invested in production. Redesigning the gear would have meant retooling factories and halting production for months. Germany couldn't afford that, so pilots kept paying the price instead. Compare this to American aircraft development during the same period. When the P-51 Mustang showed landing gear issues during testing, North American Aviation actually delayed production to fix the problem properly. The US could afford to do this because they had the industrial capacity and weren't desperately fighting for survival. Germany had neither luxury. By 1944, the situation had become absurd. The Luftwaffe was introducing jet aircraft like the Me-262 that were genuinely revolutionary, but they couldn't keep enough conventional fighters in the air because they kept losing them to accidents. Pilots who survived long enough to gain experience became incredibly valuable, but there simply weren't enough of them. The training pipeline had essentially collapsed. Let's put some numbers to this. In 1943 alone, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 1,000 pilots in non-combat accidents. That's roughly 3 pilots every single day dying in crashes that had nothing to do with enemy action. Many of these accidents involved the Bf 109. For comparison, the RAF lost about 400 pilots to training accidents that same year. Despite flying similar numbers of training hours, the Eastern Front made everything worse. Airfields there were often nothing more than cleared fields with minimal facilities. Taking off and landing a Bf 109 from a grass strip was dangerous enough. Doing it from a muddy field in Russia was practically suicidal. German pilots operating in the East had to develop techniques that would have been considered reckless anywhere else, just to survive daily operations. Winter operations were particularly brutal. The narrow track meant that any ice or snow on the runway dramatically increased the chances of a ground loop. Pilots had to land at higher speeds to maintain control, which then made it harder to stop before running out of runway. Many aircraft were simply written off after sliding into ditches or obstacles at the end of icy runways. Here's something that really drives home how bad it got. Toward the end of the war, some Luftwaffe units actually preferred to receive captured Allied aircraft rather than new Bf 109 seconds. Soviet units that captured intact Bf 109 seconds often chose not to use them operationally, citing the excessive accident rate. They'd use them for testing and evaluation, but not for actual combat missions. The FW-190, which entered service in 1941, had a much wider landing gear and was significantly easier to handle on the ground. Pilots loved it, but production capacity meant the Luftwaffe couldn't replace the Bf 109 entirely. They had to keep flying both types, which meant they had to keep training pilots on the more dangerous aircraft. So what's the final count? Conservative estimates suggest the Bf 109 killed at least 10,000 Luftwaffe pilots in accidents throughout its service life. Some historians put the number closer to 15,000. To put that in perspective, total Luftwaffe pilot deaths from all causes during the entire war were somewhere around 57,000. That means accidents potentially accounted for a quarter of all Luftwaffe pilot deaths, with the Bf 109 responsible for a significant portion of that number. This wasn't a secret. Allied intelligence knew about the Bf 109's accident rate from interrogating captured pilots. They knew German training units were losing aircraft at an alarming rate, but there was nothing the Allies needed to do about it. The Bf 109 was killing German pilots more efficiently than they could. The aircraft's combat record was genuinely impressive. In the hands of an expert pilot, it remained a formidable fighter until the end of the war. Aces like Erich Hartmann scored hundreds of kills flying various Bf 109 models. But those men were the survivors, the ones who made it through training and lived long enough to develop real skill. For every ace, there were dozens of young pilots who never made it past their first few flights. They weren't shot down by enemy fighters, they weren't hit by anti-aircraft fire, they simply lost control during takeoff, misjudged a landing, or got caught in a spin they couldn't recover from. The Bf 109 ended up being produced in greater numbers than any other fighter aircraft in history. Over 33,000 were built. It served from the Spanish Civil War in 1937 all the way through to the end of World War II in 1945. Some countries continued flying them for years afterward. But that impressive production run came at a cost measured in thousands of young men who died not fighting the enemy, but fighting their own aircraft. Willy Messerschmitt created an aircraft that was fast, well-armed, and capable of incredible performance. But he also created an aircraft that required constant attention and skill to fly safely. In an era when Germany needed to rapidly produce pilots, that combination proved fatal. The narrow landing gear decision made in the mid-30s echoed through every variant and every year of production, claiming lives until the very last day of the war. The footage that's emerged over the past few years tells a story the official records tried to hide. Training film reels show aircraft after aircraft nosing over, cartwheeling, bursting into flames on runways that should have been safe. These weren't combat losses that could be spun into propaganda about heroic sacrifice. These were preventable deaths, caused by design decisions that prioritize performance over everything else. What makes this particularly tragic is that many of these pilots never even saw combat. They died on their third solo flight, or their first cross-country navigation exercise, or during a routine landing on a calm day. The enemy never got a chance to shoot at them because their own aircraft killed them first. The Bf 109 stands as a stark reminder that engineering is about trade-offs, and sometimes those trade-offs are measured in human lives. Messerschmitt's team built an incredible fighting machine, but they built it on a foundation that was fundamentally flawed. That narrow landing gear seemed like a reasonable compromise in 1934 when the aircraft was still on paper. By 1945, it had helped kill more German pilots than some entire Allied fighter squadrons. Those young men who climbed into Bf 109 cockpits deserved better than an aircraft that fought them every second they were airborne. They deserved landing gear that didn't try to flip them during every takeoff. They deserved canopies they could actually escape from. They deserved an aircraft that gave them a fighting chance, not just against the enemy, but against the machine itself.